Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating academic critique that takes a hard look at exactly how the Quran is studied today. This analysis highlights a massive clash between traditional religious scholarship and contemporary academia. And it asks a pretty profound question. How deeply do our own built-in assumptions actually shape the way we read historical texts? Let's jump right in and unpack a provocative argument that challenges the very foundations of modern Islamic studies.
Now, to really grasp this, we first need to define a specific word, and that word is rhapsody. This is the foundational concept at the absolute heart of this entire academic debate. When we hear the word rhapsody, we usually think of music, right? But in textual analysis, it means something very specific. It refers to a text that is entirely reducible to intertextuality and borrowings. Essentially, it's a patchwork quilt. It describes anonymous popular literature where multiple authors just sort of stitch together existing ideas. Keep this exact definition in mind as we go, because whether or not this label actually applies to the Quran is the anchor for everything we are about to discuss.
To break down what the author calls the illusion of modernity, we are going to follow this argument through four clear stages. First, defining textual rhapsody. Second, the modernist claim. Third, the classical tafsir tradition. And finally, epistemology versus ideology.
Starting right off with Section 1, defining textual rhapsody and the modernist claim.
So, according to our source, the dominant school of Islamic studies today basically treats the Quranic text as exactly that, a rhapsody. By insisting the text is just a giant compilation of borrowings, modern scholars spend virtually all of their energy trying to identify its multiple anonymous authors and the outside sources they supposedly pulled from. But our author argues that this fundamentally mischaracterizes what the text actually is. And that brings us to a pretty massive question posed by the source text. Is this epistemological vision genuinely modern, or is it an illusion? See, the followers of this dominant academic school definitely view their approach as the absolute peak of modern objective analysis. But the author challenges us to step back and really ask if this method accurately describes the text, or if this claim to modernity is just masking a deeply flawed way of looking at history.
Moving on to Section 2, the illusion of modernity, looking at the claim versus the counterclaim.
There is a really incredible irony pointed out here. Today's modern Islamologists utilize a highly reductive, unidimensional focus. What that means is they basically squeeze the text just to see how it relates to older texts, and that's kind of it. On the flip side, we have the classical ulamas, the traditional Islamic scholars. Working centuries ago, they were actually much more careful. They didn't just smash the text down to its borrowed parts. Instead, they explicitly defined the role of intertextuality to protect the text from being flattened out. So the modern view, the author claims, is actually way more rigidly dogmatic than the classical scholars ever were.
This brings us to Section 3, the classical tafsir tradition, the pioneers of context.
To prove this point about the sophistication of the past, the text emphasizes a crucial historical reality. Classical scholars, the exegetes, they didn't just sit around waiting for modern academics to invent contextual analysis. They were already utilizing sociocultural context. Traditional scholars actively engaged with the literature of competing religions, the other religions of the book, and even the natural religions of their era. Why? Because these ideas were circulating in their environment, and they used them to confirm or refute interpretations of the Quran. Context was already a deeply embedded tool centuries ago.
If we look at the historical stages of this classical tafsir tradition, it's incredibly methodical. In Step 1, they looked at historical religious ideas, which are often called Israelite sources. Step 2 utilized Arabic philology and poetry. And they weren't just doing this to figure out archaic words, they used it to deeply understand theoretical and ethical concepts. Finally, Step 3 incorporated rhetorical arts, the sciences of the era, and even universal history, looking at the history of great peoples. So sociocultural context wasn't ignored at all. It was an absolutely standard, authorized part of traditional study.
The big takeaway here is that classical scholars treated intertextual context as an auxiliary science. It was a tool used to understand complex theoretical and ethical concepts within the message. The author makes this super clear. The problem isn't with studying intertextuality or sociocultural context. Those are totally valid. The problem is the status granted to them by modern scholars. When you use context to reduce the entire text to a rhapsody, to basically say it is only a collection of borrowings, you are completely misusing the tool. Classical scholars use context to understand the text. Modernists, the author argues, just use it to diminish it.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, epistemology versus ideology.
So, if classical scholars already pioneered this type of contextual analysis, what is truly driving the modern school's reductive claims today? Well, the author asserts that this modernist claim just isn't based on sound epistemology. Epistemology is simply the theory of knowledge, how we know what we know. According to the source, reducing the Quran to a rhapsody stems from a massive failure of descriptive fidelity and methodological precaution. Furthermore, the author drops a pretty heavy philosophical critique here, stating that this modern approach is totally unsupported by positive science or any modern philosophy since Immanuel Kant. They're basically arguing that these academics have completely overstepped the boundaries of what we can objectively claim to know as historical fact. They're violating the basic rules of modern critical thinking, all while claiming to be its biggest champions.
Instead of being purely objective science, the author traces the root causes of this dogmatic vision directly back to three specific historical and ideological movements. First, medieval interreligious polemics, so the old theological battles between faiths carrying over into modern academia. Second, post-Hegelian polemics, essentially 19th century philosophical movements that were highly critical of religion in general. And third, Marxist ideology. The author is suggesting that when modern scholars reduce the text to a rhapsody, they were often just acting out a resurgence of these much older ideological battles against Islam, rather than conducting neutral scientific investigation.
To wrap up this explainer, the author leaves us with a really provocative thought. Despite identifying all those ideological roots we just talked about, the author states, "I am only going to be interested in the epistemological obstacle, which seems to me to be the very root of the dogmatism of those who opt for this vision." So, the author chooses to focus purely on the breakdown of logic and knowledge building, stripping away all the politics to expose the flawed science underneath. And it leaves us with a profound question. Are modern academic approaches, even the ones presented as absolute objective fact, sometimes just ideological dogmatism masquerading as science? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating academic critique with me.